Hi. All right, I'm going to give a quick primer on aesthetics in philosophy, and this is going to be pretty conversational. I don't want you to worry too much about um, going in depth in terms of knowing about Hume and Kant, who I'm going to talk about here. I just want you to have some background in how aesthetics is talked about in philosophy, because some of the people we read might mention Hume and Kant. They are the ones that get trotted out all the time. Um, in the course of discussing art and beauty and feminist responses to the ways that those things have been talked about for a long time. So let's just get to it. In the 1700s, aesthetics started to become its own area in philosophy. That's when the term aesthetics was coined, and um, the starting point that I'm going to talk about first is Hume's essay of the standard of taste. This was something that he wrote for a general audience, so it's pretty accessible, I would say, and it's kind of fun, and lots of people talk about it. So, Hume starts off with a puzzle about taste, and I think it's one that we still experience as quite relevant to our thinking about art and beauty. And the puzzle is a contradiction between two different intuitions that we have about beauty and good artworks. And yes, I'm running those two together. Danto, who we're going to read next week, is going to point out that you need to separate those two things. Artistic excellence is not always the same thing as it being beautiful. But at the time, in the 1700s, those two things were merged together. Art was considered good insofar as it was beautiful, or it would have been strange to say that an artwork was excellent as a work of art without also thinking that it was beautiful. Beautiful in its imitation of real life in some way. So that's just one thing to note. Those two things were closely connected at the time. Um, Back to Hume's puzzle. The puzzle is we have these two intuitions. The first one is that we tend to think beauty is a matter of feeling pleasure in response to objects, flowers, waterfalls, wonderful works of art, humans, beautiful people. Um, they give us pleasure. That's a distinctive response to beauty. And in part because of that, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We can find different things beautiful. Whatever you want to find beautiful, or whatever you do find beautiful, that's okay. And the thought there is that if beauty is really just a matter of feeling pleasure in response to something, it doesn't really involve a claim about what the object is. If saying that something is beautiful basically comes down to that thing gives me pleasure, if somebody else does not find it beautiful and they say that thing does not give me pleasure, there's no real contradiction there. We just feel different things, and that's fine. Um, the judgment that something is beautiful, if all that it is this thing makes me feel pleasure, is not actually giving you information about some kind of property that the object has. It's not like saying that thing is a square. If another person says, no, that's not a square, you've got a real disagreement going there. There's a contradiction between thinking that something has the property of being a square and that it does not have the property of being a square. Okay, so that's our first intuition about beauty, is that this is just a matter of feeling a pleasure in response to something, and thus there's no real arguing about it. Everybody can feel whatever they do in response to art or beautiful objects, and that's fine. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, as I was saying. And this is still a super common way of thinking about beauty and art. However, it is in tension with the second intuition that Hume starts off his famous paper with. And that is that we definitely think some artworks are better than others. Okay, so those examples are Milton and Ogilvy. I think these are poets, and I don't think many of us really remember who Ogilvy is anymore. I don't know. If you know Ogilvy, let me know. But apparently not as good as Milton. And Hume describes how it would be as outrageous to say that, say, a really wonderful poet is no better than a really terrible poet. This would be as outrageous as saying that a mountain is the same as a molehill, or that an ocean is the same as a puddle. There just seems to be a clear difference between really great artworks and really bad ones. And so that's our second intuition about art and beauty. again, some things definitely seem to be beautiful, other things are not beautiful. So, on this second intuition, we tend to think that something's beauty or its artistic excellence is actually like an objective property of the thing, in that there's a right and a wrong judgment to be made about it. Okay, so what are we going to do? These are incompatible intuitions. Either beauty is just a matter of feeling pleasure in response to something and anything goes, or there actually is an objective fact of the matter about what is beautiful and what isn't, and what is excellent art or is not. Hume's solution to that problem has to be in line with his empiricism, first of all. Hume is somebody who thinks that we come to know the world through experience, as an empiricist does. And so his solution to the problem of taste, as he calls it, is to say, okay, it is true that beauty is just a feeling of pleasure in response to objects. However, there are some objects that are, as he says, calculated to please creatures with our sensory setup and cognitive setup too. So he doesn't say what properties these objects that are calculated to please us are. What kind of, how does an object have to look, say, in order to be beautiful? He doesn't kind of give us specifics on that. He doesn't think we can give rules for what's going to be beautiful in terms of the properties that they're going to have. And that would be one way on this picture of knowing what is beautiful. If certain objects are calculated to please creatures with our sensory and cognitive setup, then perhaps we should be able to list out the qualities or the properties that beautiful objects are going to have. Hume doesn't think that that's going to be a very viable solution. People have tried for a long time to give rules for beauty, and they're rarely ever convincing. Mary Motherstill has a wonderful book in the 80s arguing for just that any rule you put forward for beauty is not going to be convincing. It's great, a great book. Instead, he thinks that we can find a standard to settle disputes about which things really are beautiful and which are not, by looking to those people who have a very refined sense of taste. So if we think of beauty as a matter of responding to objects with pleasure when it is appropriate, when they are really objects that are calculated to please creatures of our kind, Hume thinks that the disagreement we see about that, and there's a lot of it, is because most of us are kind of defective judges of aesthetics, things that get in the way of our ability to properly sense, basically, the beauty of objects. So it can be helpful to use a parallel here with other sensations. So for instance, with something like smell, if you want to know how something really smells, you don't ask somebody who currently has a bad head cold. They're not going to be able to tell you how it really smells, even though, you know, it smells a certain way to them. Maybe it doesn't smell because their nose is plugged up. Still, we think that how things really smell, or what color they really are, that this is determined under a standard set of conditions, both in terms of lighting, say, for color, and also for sensory operations. Your senses have to be working right. For beauty, I mean, all that has to be true. Your senses do have to be working. But beauty isn't just the color of something or the smell of something. It's a harder thing to pin down. You can't exactly say which color or slash of dynamic lines, etc., make the thing beautiful. That would be an attempt to come up with a rule that, as I say, is probably going to be unconvincing. Still, Hume thinks that just like you want to ask somebody whose senses are working properly in order to know what secondary qualities like colors and sounds the object really has, for beauty, you want to ask those people whose taste is functioning properly and nothing is getting in the way. And he lays out a few different ways in which our taste can be going awry. So the first way is that we can not be very good at making fine distinctions when we sense things. So the objects that we see, and we can think here of people assessing the taste of wine. Most of us, when we drink a glass of wine, we're not going to be able to tease out the subtle differences in the flavors that are described, say, on the bottle jacket. But we can train ourselves to be quite conscious of very fine distinctions and elements within sensory experiences. So he calls it delicacy of taste. So an aesthetic judge who is going to be able to tell you which objects really are beautiful is going to have a delicate taste that can make lots of fine distinctions. They're also going to be someone who can make lots of comparisons between one thing and another. So this is another way that most of us, our tastes can go wrong, is that we don't have enough ability to draw comparisons between different things, again, to bring out their distinctive features. And this goes along with not being very practiced at doing so. We just haven't spent very much time, say, tasting different wines and learning to discern the different tastes in them, the different notes, etc. So we can't draw the comparisons that somebody else who has practiced a lot at making those fine distinctions could make. Hume also thinks that for most of us, our taste is compromised by prejudice. And by this he means not being able to put ourselves into the position of the audience that was intended for, say, a certain work of art. We tend to think we have prejudice in terms of thinking from our own position in time and in culture, etc. And somebody who approaches art without prejudice will be able to shift into the mind frame of somebody for whom the artwork was intended. So that's interesting. We're actually going to talk a lot about whether or not that's possible and to what extent that's possible in this course. And then finally, the last thing that Hume thought was needed for to be a really good judge of beauty was to have good sense. You have to have the ability to, say, track a plot and figure out where the plot holes are. There's an aspect of reasoning about appreciating various kinds of artworks, whether or not they make sense, this kind of thing. So, all together, if you have all of these things, they're all in great working order, then you'd be a good judge of taste and a judge of beauty for Hume. And he thought that we could settle disputes about what's really beautiful by asking these judges, sometimes they're called ideal judges, and whatever that group of people all agree is great art, say, that's great art. And it doesn't matter if you don't agree with them or you don't grasp what's so great about that artwork. You can just take their word for it. Like we can just take the word of wine tasters that something is really excellent or not, even though we can't quite taste it ourselves. That's Hume's picture at any rate. And it's a really interesting one. It's in part for that reason, that it turns out in the end, your own response to an artwork isn't the ultimate word on whether or not it's beautiful or a great work of art. You kind of have to listen to the experts. It's an expert-based kind of view of this. And that might sound right at times. It does go against the grain, I think, of a strong intuition we have about beauty and art, which is that you should base your judgments upon your own response. And that isn't to say that you're not sometimes wrong, but in order to see how or why you're wrong, your own response has to grow and change and you have to be convinced by the critic or the expert. So, Hume's view, there are lots of potential problems with it. One of the main ones is that how do we identify the ideal critics? Who are these people? Where do they come from? How do we know who they are? Are there any such people, or is this just like, if there were such people, we would have a standard of taste, but we're fuddling along without, so are these people actually real, or are they just an ideal? That's one question we could have. If we think that there actually is some practical application of this theory, and there could be good critics at least, if not ideal critics, that we could identify to actually turn to their judgment and trust them about what is actually beautiful or actually artistically great, wouldn't identifying those people itself require having good taste? Like how do I know that someone's making correct judgments about what's beautiful? How do I assess, say, the delicacy of a critic's taste if I don't myself have the ability to determine which objects have more delicacy and complexity? Delicacy applies, that's a description of your function of your taste, not the object. Sorry, that was but anyway, you get what I'm saying. How can we find these critics and know that they're making correct judgments unless other than applying our own sense of what a correct judgment would be? Okay, it's a big problem for Hume. A problem that is leveled by feminists against Hume, and not just by feminists, I think, but is that his picture of an ideal critic, this person who has spent a lot of time practicing making judgments of art and has good reason and is unbiased, unprejudiced, and it sounds a lot like an educated gentleman of Hume's time. And you might wonder, is this person, although it's presented to us as being, this is what it would take to be a good critic of art, no matter when you are operating in time or history. This is just always going to be what's required for making good judgments of art. You say, actually, this is more situated in Hume's particular cultural and social context than he suggests. And maybe this isn't going to be the ideal critic for everybody. Christine Battersby, we're going to read her book in a bit, but she has a paper where she suggests that maybe there could be other kinds of ideal critics, like an ideal feminist critic, for instance. I think this is a really interesting idea, but I'd have to think more about it. How exactly would we spell out, say, the conditions for an ideal feminist critic? At any rate, this whole view that beauty is a matter of feeling pleasure, there are some aspects of that Kant, coming after Hume, is going to pick up on and agree with, such as that beauty is largely a matter of responding with pleasure to something. However, as in many aspects of their philosophy, Kant is going to respond to Hume's view by taking a very different tack. So, for Kant, judgments of beauty have to be grounded upon one's own pleasure. So there's no kind of passing the responsibility for making judgments about beauty off to an ideal critic or an expert or something. For Kant, it is essential to the kind of judgment beauty is that it be grounded on one's own feeling of pleasure. And for Kant, a part of that is that he thinks judgments of beauty are not cognitive judgments. So a cognitive judgment applies a concept to something that you experience in the world. I'm going to give a really quick little rundown on how cognition is working for Kant. So, first of all, we have sensory information coming in, a sensory manifold, as Kant calls it. That manifold is held together by the imagination. The imagination kind of reproduces that sensory information so that we have something to work with, something that continues through time that we can apply a concept to. And then, in order to experience an object in the world, to cognize an object in the world, we have to take that sensory information and find some organization within it, order it some way, to take that kind of mess of information and see a chair or a tree. And to do that, we apply a concept from the understanding. These are faculties of cognition for Kant. We have the imagination, we have the understanding that has concepts or rules that we apply to sensory information in order to make sense of them and have a determinate judgment that it is a chair before us or it is a tree that we are seeing across the field. Okay, so that is a quick rundown. Sometimes we have the concept just ready to be applied in experience. Judgment is the third faculty by which we move between the information that imagination is holding together or synthesizing and the concepts from the understanding that will be applied. So sometimes that is right, the concept is right there for judgment and it just grabs it. Okay, tree, there's the chair. All right. But other times we encounter things that we don't know what they are. We've got this thing that we're experiencing, and in those cases, judgment needs to reflect and it goes looking for a concept. There's work involved to make sense of that thing. And Kant thinks that when we see beautiful things, a process of reflective judgment takes place. So it's kind of like we see something and we're not quite sure what to make of it, even though we are making a determinate cognitive judgment that that is a rose, say, or that that is a beautiful waterfall or a beautiful person. There are concepts being applied, but the beauty of that object isn't captured by those concepts. And Kant thinks that what it is to find something beautiful is that that object sparks off a reflective activity between our cognitive faculties, a playful, harmonious, free activity between the imagination and the understanding. They're kind of playing together, and it's free because it's not governed by the goal of finding another concept to apply to that object and make a further determinate judgment about it. And it is this free reflective activity between the imagination and the understanding. They're playing together in response to a beautiful thing that gives us a feeling of pleasure. So whereas Hume's model, it seemed much more to be akin to a good feeling rubbing on your skin or something, the pleasure of beauty, even though I don't think that's necessarily really the case, but it seemed, Hume's view seems a lot more to be thinking of the pleasure of beauty on the model of sensory kind of pleasure. Whereas for Kant, the pleasure that you feel in response to a beautiful thing doesn't come from the sensations that it gives you. It comes from this mental activity that the object ignites or sets off. So what's really pleasurable is this free and playful activity between your imagination and your understanding. Okay, it's a more intellectual kind of pleasure. So, because Kant thinks that beauty is a matter of taking pleasure in an activity between the cognitive faculties of imagination and understanding, these are the same faculties that have to come together and work together in order to produce cognitive judgments, say that that's a tree or that's a chair, things that we expect everybody to agree with us about. And in fact, we have to kind of assume that the basic functions of cognition work the same in everybody to get a shared world of objects that we all experience the same. So if I say that's a tree, I gotta think that you should be seeing a tree too, and that your concept of tree should work the same as mine does, because that's what a concept is. It's a rule. It has to work the same for everybody. Okay, so Kant takes the fact that he thinks beauty is a pleasure that we take in the playful and free activity of our cognitive faculties, the same faculties that are involved in cognitive judgments that we expect everybody to agree with us about, that we should also be able to think that other people should agree with us about beauty. It should be something that works the same in all of us. Okay, so this is how Kant can argue that judgments of beauty are, on the one hand, they're subjective in the sense that they are grounded upon your own feeling of pleasure. That's subjective in the sense that it's a feeling that happens inside you. That's the sense of subjective that's there. But they're also universal. It's a judgment that's grounded upon your own personal feeling of pleasure, but because that pleasure is one that you take in a mental operation, a kind of free, playful activity between your cognitive faculties, it's a pleasure that you can say everybody ought to feel this, like I do, when they see this object. So it's a subjectively universal judgment for Kant. Okay, I find this idea fascinating. In fact, I wrote a dissertation about it. Kant, this is really interesting, this idea. He coined this term of speaking in a universal voice when we give judgments of beauty. When you say, I find that beautiful, you're sort of speaking for the subject as such, for the person as such. You're speaking with a universal voice for all of humanity. This is beautiful. Okay, and there's something I find something compelling about this, that the idea that there is something that's at the level of how cognition operates, but also grounded in pleasure, that we expect to be in community with everybody else. It's a universal community. of human perceivers and feelers. That's what beauty brings into it. We're not just a community of people who cognize things the same way, apply the same cognitive rules. We're a community that feels the same way. We feel beauty, we feel pleasure in response to something in the same way. I love that combination. It's sort of surprising. Yeah, okay. I'm not going to rant about that too much more. That's the positive. On the negative side, there's lots to criticize here, and in fact, Kant is not in fashion these days at all in philosophical aesthetics. In fact, Kant is often trotted out as exactly what you do not want to be saying and do not want to be doing, and I think there's some good reasons for that. This very idea of speaking with the universal voice, again, well, sometimes there's something moving about it. Yes, whoever you are, we're all going to find the night sky beautiful. We're all going to find babies cute. There's something kind of reassuring or something about that. But at the same time, that reassurance can be one that just flattens out all of our differences and doesn't take any account of the way that even our ideas about what everybody should share are shaped by our particular cultural and class-based, racialized perspective on the world as individuals. So a view like Kant's can seem rather tyrannical, even. The idea that one would find something beautiful and say, every single person on this earth should agree with me that this is beautiful, that just seems way too outsized for this judgment. Wow, way to lay the hammer down. Like, how could I ever have such hubris? It just seems to be so, you're just making such a strong claim. It turns a judgment of beauty into such a strong claim with no seeming consideration of the ways that our differences could shape those kinds of judgments. That I think legitimately comes in for a lot of criticism. I'm not sure. It has been criticized by someone like Alexander Nehamas in recent years for just the idea that the end goal would be for all of us to agree about what's beautiful. According to Nehamas, this is like an apocalyptic vision. This would be a terrible world to live in if everybody agreed with about what's beautiful. I don't actually agree with him about that. I think we already have a lot of agreement, say, about the beauty of the night sky, the beauty of flowers, the cuteness of babies, even though that's not beauty. And I don't think we're troubled by that. I don't think that deadens the conversation. We have written poetry about the night sky, and I think every culture for hundreds and hundreds of years. And in fact, there's something further inspiring about the fact that we all share that, seemingly. Anyway, so I don't know about that particular criticism, but certainly the idea that on Kant's view, by speaking about your own pleasure in beauty, you'd be speaking for everybody just seems rather outrageous. In the scope of its claim. There was something else I wanted to mention, another criticism of Kant. Oh yes, okay, so the other thing to know about Kant's view, I explained about the free play, the free harmonious activity of the understanding and the imagination. This is what is sparked off by judgments of beauty, and then it's a pleasurable, playful, mental feeling of life. But one of the other things he says about that is that free play is only sparked off by the formal features of the object. And that basically means, what do we mean by formal features of the object? This is another good question to answer at the start, because people are going to talk about this too. And we'll say more about this. I'll give us a better example and talk more about this later. But the formal features of an aesthetic object are the ones that you can describe without talking about its content, kind of what it is a representation of. So things like line, color, shape, the arrangement of those elements, the composition, whether it's balanced, what the focal point is, a sense of rhythm to the elements. Those kinds of features are the formal elements or features of the artwork, and Kant thought that that is all that is responsible for sparking off the free play of the imagination and the understanding. Now, why might that be? Well, one of the reasons is because Kant is looking for something that wouldn't be influenced by the particularities of one's social and cultural position. He's looking for something that we could make a universally valid judgment about. So by excluding content, emotional components of artworks, what it is representing, whether this is a horse or a flower, etc. It might be a flower that's beautiful, but it's not in its being a flower that it's beautiful. All that is beautiful is the arrangement of lines. Even color is excluded by Kant at times, which is probably, I think, yeah, we gotta have color in there. Anyways, this is called Kant's formalism. And it's another point of criticism by a lot of people, as you could imagine. And I think for any effort to kind of continue talking about Kant as irrelevant to contemporary philosophical aesthetics, you've got to wrestle with the formalism and somehow expand this idea so that it's capable of talking about or responses of beauty to more than just formal elements, basically black and white lines in their arrangement. And I actually think that that's possible. That was part of my dissertation. But yeah, this is another idea that we'll talk about a little bit. I hope that I'll talk about it a little bit when we discuss art's autonomy. Because again, like Kant believes that the judgment of beauty is quite separate from from practical judgments and our interests. So there are different kinds of pleasure that we can take in things. We can take pleasure in things that are of practical use to us. A warm, snuggly bed, a very good meal, that feeling of fullness in our tummy, a nice back scratch, a warm bath. Lots of things, sensations make us feel good. Good taste, tasty food. Kant calls this the agreeable, pleasure in the agreeable. And he thinks that that pleasure is really tied to our organic being. It's a pleasure that's connected to our survival and our flourishing as organic beings. And so he thinks that that pleasure is internally connected to an interest in having more of it, and then a desire in having more of that real thing, another warm bath, another delicious meal, etc. So it's tied to our kind of personal interests in being well cared for and sustaining ourselves as organic beings. Another kind of pleasure that we can take is in things being morally right. There's a kind of satisfaction in things being well suited to their purpose, right? So there is one in being morally right, but more broadly than that, we take pleasure in things being a good example of the kind of thing they are. Basically a pleasure in perfection. So when we have a certain idea of what a horse should be, to be, say, a capable of helping with a certain kind of work, we might take pleasure in a really excellent example of a horse. But that pleasure is really dependent upon that concept of that thing, because we need the concept there in order to assess how well this particular instance suits the kind of thing that it's supposed to be. So that's another kind of pleasure. And there again, Kant thinks that it is tied to a kind of interest in things being as they ought to be. Whereas he thinks that the pleasure of beauty is completely disconnected from all kind of interest that we might have or desire that we might have in the real existence of things. He calls the pleasure of beauty disinterested, which doesn't mean that we're bored or something. It doesn't mean that we don't find it interesting. We do. It's disinterested in this kind of technical sense, in that the pleasure we take is not in the actual existence of the object. It's just in the form of the object, the composition of its formal elements. Whether or not the thing actually exists, that's kind of beside the point to its beauty. And to practical concerns in general, that's the big lesson. Practical concerns, whether or not the house is actually going to protect you from the rain, is a separate question to whether or not it was made beautifully, how beautiful the architecture is. And a painting, we can have lots of practical questions about that. What does it say to the neighbors that you've got this painting hanging up on your wall? Maybe it has some kind of social import. It helps your status in various ways. Maybe it's handy for covering up that hole that somebody punched in the wall. There are various practical purposes that the painting could serve. But we want to say, Kant wants to say, when it comes to aesthetic pleasure, the judgment of beauty, we don't care about kind of the practical functions that the painting could serve. We care about just the pleasure that can or cannot come from its formal properties. And those don't really depend on its actual, they aren't about or desiring its actual existence. Even though we might care about its actual existence, we want beautiful paintings to exist, it isn't their physical existence in the world that makes them beautiful. It's just their formal properties. Okay, I don't know if I did such a great job of explaining that last point, but we can come back to it if you have more questions. Okay, so yes, we will. We'll talk more about various features that have come out in our conversation of Kant. Speaking in a universal voice, this thought that artworks can do this. I'm going to say more about that when we read Ben Lerner in relation to poetry. Sorry, Chris, I'm in the middle of recording something. Sorry, no, can you wait 5 minutes? Thanks. Okay. Right, so speaking in the universal voice is one of them. Can art do this? Then also, do we have aesthetic criteria for art, say the formal properties that produce the beauty, the pleasure of beauty, that work the same for everybody, that are kind of universal criteria for art? And then about the autonomy of art and aesthetic value from other practical concerns of life, and whether or not that goes along with attention to purely formal elements of the work, excluding content that might connect with further social and political issues and responses to what they're saying, the kind of meaning or message of the work. All right, okay, thanks.